Diet, supplements, and multiple sclerosis. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Conor Kerley, a dietitian and nutrition researcher. He himself was diagnosed with MS as a teenager and has dedicated his life to studying nutrition and human disease. He's won various awards and is active on social media. Good to see you, Conor.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Beaver. Delighted to be here.
So it's good to see you after all these years. I've seen so many of your posts on Twitter. I know you were in Los Angeles and we didn't get a chance to meet up. We're also authors of different chapters of the same book, Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis Handbook. Good to finally see you.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe the next time I'm in LA or anytime you come to Ireland, we can meet in person.
For sure. Despite my appearance, I am 0% Irish and have never been to Ireland. I get that all the time. I'm even
Not,
wearing
not,
green today.
not yet.
Not yet. That's right. So I know you were diagnosed with MS when you were only 15 years old. What was that like? And is that what inspired you to study nutrition and dedicate your career to it?
Yeah, so my first symptoms came in December 2002, so just after Christmas. And at the time I was 15, and my symptoms were quite severe. It was actually interesting. I'll just go into a little bit of background because it's kind of interesting. I was a very keen sports player. I played lots of sports, soccer, Irish football, basketball would have been my main sport. But I had some injuries on my knees. So for Christmas, instead of getting the usual stuff, jewelry or clothes or whatever, I got a stepping machine where I could build up my leg muscles without impacting and jumping up and down or anything like that. So one day, I think it was about the 27th of December, I did like a crazy session on the stepper in the kitchen. And, I was delighted about myself. And the next morning I woke up and I had a really bad dead leg. I thought, oh my God, I've gotten so unfit over a couple of days of eating too much Christmas food and so on. But that dead leg did not go away. In fact, it got much worse. And then actually on December 31st, right as we were going from 2002 and 2003, I was in a brain scan at midnight and I really was quite ill. So I was admitted into a major neurological hospital here in Ireland, and after all the tests, MRIs, lumbar puncture, CTs, countless blood tests, and some strange symptoms, I was eventually diagnosed with MS. But I had three relapses: one on the left, one on the right, and one on the face. And yeah, it was a strange time back in 2002. I didn't have internet in my house. I don't think there was any such thing as Facebook, or maybe it was just on the Harvard campus. It certainly wasn't a big thing. There was no WhatsApp. I wasn't able to communicate with anybody with MS. And I used to get my information from the local library in my town in Ireland called Dundalk, which is on the northern border of Ireland, on Northern Ireland. So it was an interesting time, but thankfully, my solution was to figure out how to help myself, and I decided to study nutrition. Because nobody had ever mentioned nutrition to me. No nurses, doctors, OTs, physios, speech therapists had ever talked about nutrition. I thought nutrition had to be important. Again, mostly I was interested in nutrition from a sports performance angle, but now it was all about health. So I was lucky that I was so young. I was able to go to college and study at Trinity College here in Dublin, dietetics, human nutrition and dietetics. But obviously, that's not a solution for everybody. Not everybody can take 4 or 5 years out of their busy schedule and study nutrition. So hopefully, I can start bringing more and more information to people with MS all over the world.
Yeah, over my career, I've had seen numerous people who had symptoms that were due to MS, but they were initially attributed to injuries or orthopedic problems. So you've had MS for 22 years. How are you doing now?
Good, good. Yeah, thankfully, I'm symptom free, I'm relapse free, and I haven't been taking any medications for quite a while now, for about 21 years. But thankfully, no symptoms, and yeah, going from strength to strength. I suppose I'm a busy guy. I run my own company. My wife and I are expecting a baby. We've just moved house. And thankfully, all of my symptoms are absolutely fine. I'm very busy. Stress gets into my life and so on, but I try and do as much as I can in terms of my lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, sleep well, exercise, or stress reduction techniques and so on. So thankfully, touch wood, things are going very, very well.
All right, so let's get into different dietary principles Dr. Roy Swank, very famous in the United States from University of Oregon Health Sciences. In the 1940s, he did some epidemiologic research in Norway, found that people who lived more inland, who consumed more dairy and saturated fat like beef, tended to have higher rates of MS. People who were more coastal, ate less dairy, more seafood, had less MS. Do you think that's real? Do you think dairy and saturated fat are linked to MS?
Yeah, so just to start off, a really nice introduction to Dr. Roy Swank. So Swank really was a remarkable guy. I think he lived to be 99, and I think he worked as a scientist and a neurologist until he was in his 90s. So, he was a really remarkable guy. And he's probably the first person in the whole world to be interested in nutrition and MS. And I think some of his peers probably thought he was a bit of a crazy guy. How could nutrition be linked to MS? So really have to commend Dr. Swank for that. Um, his, as you mentioned, his studies in Norway were looking at dietary patterns and MS, but these are what we call observational. So just for anybody listening, it provides an association, but it doesn't prove anything. It just provides an interesting association. But then Dr. Swank actually went on and then did what we call an intervention study, and he asked people to change their diet and he followed them over time. So his major study was done on 144 people with MS, all had MS, and he asked them all to follow the same diet, which now is called the Swank diet, but essentially it was a diet really low in saturated fat. And I always say to my patients and anybody I'm speaking to, so saturated fat, generally the easiest way to think of it is fat that's hard at room temperature. So we think of like butter, we think of the fat on like a steak or on a pork chop, something like that. And then vice versa, something like olive oil, which is liquid at room temperature, is very low in saturated fats, which is an easy way for anybody who's not maybe a dietitian or a nutrition expert to be able to visualize, the sources of saturated fat. Um, so it was really a diet very low in saturated fat. And he published the results of this research every couple of years, right up to 34 years and even 50 years. And this is quite interesting because if I called you up in the morning, Dr. Beaber, and said, okay, let's do a research study and let's publish our results in 2075, you'd probably say, no way, I'm not interested, and neither are my patients. But this was fantastic to see such a study done. The problem is this study was done in such a time when there was no blood samples were taken, no MRIs or other modern techniques were done. And also, it's now 2024, maybe 70 years after Swank's study started, and we're still not very good at measuring what people eat. So I'm not very confident that Dr. Swank was able to measure what we eat, 70 years ago. So it's a really interesting study. It's a really interesting body of work, but I don't think it provides any strong evidence in and of itself. In saying that, there is now significant evidence, and which has been emerging over the last sort of 50 years, that saturated foods rich in saturated fat can increase inflammation, and MS being an inflammatory disorder makes sense that excess saturated fat would not be a good thing. Public health authorities all over the world recommend limiting saturated fat. So it does seem like a good idea for anybody with MS, or in fact, anybody without MS, so everybody, to not overconsume saturated fat. So again, your butters, your cheeses, your fatty meats. So it's a good idea to limit those for heart health, for diabetes, for overall inflammation, and probably for autoimmune diseases, including MS. You also mentioned the dairy angle. So dairy is extremely controversial, and for good reason, because the research is very inconsistent, and the evidence from human research regarding dairy and MS is actually quite weak. However, dairy products are generally high in saturated fat, particularly butter and cheeses. So that's one mark against dairy products as such. In addition, several studies have actually shown dairy is linked to MS, but also other autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes and inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And there's a theory that autoimmune diseases have a lot in common, and I'm sure you will have your own thoughts on that. So potentially if something increases risk of type 1 diabetes, it may also be bad for MS and so on. So that's quite interesting. And the link between dairy and other autoimmune disease, between MS and other autoimmune diseases and dairy seems to be at least partially due to dairy protein, so not just the saturated fat. And there's some really interesting research done in animal models of MS. that look at a specific dairy protein and lead to a process called molecular mimicry. And in molecular mimicry, some of these proteins from the diet go undigested, and then they have a similar makeup to the proteins in our own human tissue. For example, some of these proteins look similar to the spinal cord in the brain, and then our immune systems actually attack these food proteins and then see the similar proteins in the spinal cord and attack those. So that's kind of interesting. And then, but they're mostly animal studies, but there are some small human studies in people with MS have also reported increased immune reactions to dairy proteins. And the final thing is there's some really interesting research looking at viruses found in dairy products. For example, Mycobacterium avium subspecies paratuberculosis, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we often abbreviate it to MASP. And several studies have reported increased immune reaction to dairy viruses in people with MS and other autoimmune diseases. So overall, the evidence linking MS to dairy is there, but it's not super strong. And for me, I come back to what I call the risk benefit ratio. So, for example, what is the benefit of avoiding dairy? Well, you're going to probably decrease your source of saturated fats. And although not proven, you will decrease your exposure to dairy proteins and dairy viruses, which may have knock on benefits for MS and other autoimmune diseases. On the flip side, what is the risk of avoiding dairy? Well, for example, you're probably going to decrease your intake of calcium, vitamin D, iodine, and other nutrients. But these nutrients can be gotten from other sources which aren't dairy. So, we have to weigh up the benefit and the risk. And the last point, which really comes in here, is if somebody really enjoys dairy products. Some of my patients tell me, I really enjoy cheese, so I don't want to give it up. I can't justifiably tell them that they should really cut out cheese because it's going to really help them because we don't have that current evidence. So if there's anybody out there who really enjoys dairy products and prefers to consume them knowing that there is a small risk, that's absolutely fine. But for me personally, I don't consume dairy products because for me, I'm happy to forego them, get those nutrients from other sources, and then not expose myself to those excess saturated fats, dairy proteins, and dairy viruses.
Okay, so there's a lot of criticism of animal foods in general. I'm in Los Angeles. Veganism is very popular. A whole foods plant-based diet is very popular, often for ethical reasons. One of my relatives is vegan and will always have to go to a vegan restaurant when they visit. Do you think that animal products are bad in general? What about seafood? What about egg whites? Do you think there's any benefit to being a strict vegan?
It's a really, really good question. So I always start off that obviously, I always say the V words, vegan, vegetarian, are quite emotive words for lots of different reasons, for whether it's someone's in favor or really not in favor of those dietary patterns or even those lifestyles. Because as people are quick to point out, vegan is not always just about diet, it's about, lifestyle as such. But I always point out that when we talk about nutrition, strictly nutrition, not getting into any ethics or climate change or anything like that, strictly nutrition, when we talk about vegan and vegetarian, that's essentially saying what somebody doesn't eat. Like a vegan does not eat foods derived from animal products, but it doesn't tell you what to do eat. So I'm pretty sure Oreos are vegan and Coca-Cola is vegan and so on. And that is not necessarily good for anybody, whether they eat animal products or not. You also mentioned things like fish. So when we talk about fish or seafood, it really depends on there's different types of fish. So there's oily fish, things like salmon, sardine, mackerel, and then we've got non-oily fish like cod, and then obviously whiting being a white fish. And then we've got your crustaceans, which I know are quite popular in some places in the US, like crab, lobster, prawn, or shrimp. Now, when it comes to research on MS and fish, there's a lack of research in general, but research does seem to suggest that fish may be a healthier choice than meat, but maybe not quite as healthy as legumes like chickpeas, lentils, and kidney beans, and so on, and also seeds and nuts. So the idea going back was that omega-3 fats had anti-inflammatory effects and also benefits for brain health. But research looking at omega-3 and MS has been largely disappointing. And in my sort of professional opinion, this is probably due to two things. Number one, a single nutrient like omega-3 or vitamin D is unlikely to be powerful enough to improve outcomes, clinical outcomes in MS patients. But number two, really, that the health benefits of omega-3 fatty acids probably depend on the amount and type of other fats eaten, and also, the overall diet. So there's no point in having like Pizza Hut and KFC all day and then having omega-3 capsules. That's not really going to improve anyone's health. Um, so just circling back, then you talked about like veganism and vegetarianism, and then whole foods, plant-based being quite popular in Los Angeles. So if anybody hasn't heard of a whole foods diet, I suppose a whole foods plant-based diet, I mentioned at the start that veganism was really what you don't eat, whereas whole food plant-based is about what you do eat. And what is that? It's fruits, it's vegetables, it's whole grains, it's legumes, again, like your chickpeas, your lentils, kidney beans, and like seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, and so on. And then nuts, your cashew nuts, your Brazil nuts, your hazelnuts. So all of those foods are pretty healthy for pretty much everybody. So absolutely, it's a really good idea to eat more of those, I think, based on the current evidence for overall health and also for MS. And the one sort of caveat I would say, if anybody is following a largely or a totally plant-based diet, whether they've got MS or not, is just to make sure that you consume a regular source of vitamin B12, either from fortified foods or from supplements or from both.
Certainly, it may be harder to be strictly vegan than people think. Even vitamin D3 is usually not vegan. But talking about legumes, there's another class of diets which is very popular, paleo type diets, advocated by Dr. Terry Walls, for instance, who reported improvement of her secondary progressive MS. Do you think there's any link between gluten or wheat and MS or other potential allergens? You mentioned legumes, or you could even talk about nightshade vegetables. Do you think that's legitimate or it's not related to MS?
So we really have a lack of research in all of these areas. As I mentioned with dairy, that risk benefit. Similarly for wheat and gluten are ubiquitous in the food supply. So to be strictly wheat and gluten free is not that easy, and we just have to ask somebody with strict who follows a strict celiac diet. And celiac disease, obviously being a disease where the body has an autoimmune reaction against gluten, and that's very separate from gluten intolerance or somebody who wants to follow a gluten-free diet. I think the evidence is quite weak around wheat and gluten. At the same time, if somebody does want to cut it out, I don't have a major problem as long as they're not replacing it with, other junk foods. So, for example, eating a lot of refined gluten-free breads and pastas, that really we should be aiming for whole varieties of grains. So, for example, brown rice is gluten-free, potatoes, sweet potatoes, they're gluten-free and really, really healthy foods. Um, I suppose coming back to your sort of overall question about these sort of Paleolithic diets, I don't know Terry Walls personally, but I am aware of her and her work, and I really commend anybody who does research into lifestyles. So, very aware of Dr. Walls and her protocol and so on. So paleo or Paleolithic diets are based on the idea that humans are hunter-gatherers and that modern foods aren't really suited to the human digestive systems. And this is very interesting, but there's lots of differences between modern society and the Paleolithic that isn't just nutrition. So, for example, stress, pollution, hygiene, and lots more, medications, and we could go on. It's not just a diet. Also, we mentioned at the very start that it was very difficult to measure dietary intake from us in 2024 and also for Dr. Swank back in the 50s. But how are we going to measure dietary intake in Paleolithic periods like thousands of years ago? So it turns out we don't really know. So um, we don't really know for sure what people ate in Paleolithic times. And some research suggests that actually they did lots more gathering than hunting, so lots more fruits and tubers than hunting animals all day. And to an extent, that makes a little bit of sense because if someone said to me, Connor, do you want to have all those delicious berries, or do you want to chase a tiger which could potentially eat you, and you're going to be exhausted and whatever? It makes sense that people would eat what was convenient as such. And I suppose the other thing is like paleo diets generally restrict things like dairy, which we've spoken about, but also restrict things like legumes, gluten, and soy, which I don't think there's necessarily much rationale for. But on the flip side, they recommend high amounts of vegetables, nuts, seeds, and berries. And I certainly agree with all of that. So if somebody is going to add more veg, berries, and nuts and seeds to the diet, I think that's very good for the health, whether they're following paleo or not.
Okay, so now to move on to supplements, obviously diet is very important. Some nutrients are kind of deficient in the diet, such as vitamin D, for instance, or B12 if you have a certain type of diet. And so you set out to design this supplement specifically for people with multiple sclerosis and neurological diseases called NeuroFix. And just to be clear, Connor and I, we have no financial relationship or anything like that. We just spoke for the first time, other than messaging each other on Twitter. And I'll include a link in the notes below if you want to check it out. But obviously, it's hard to take a lot of different supplements, so it's convenient to take one thing. And I want to talk about why you chose the ingredients to include in the supplement. So obviously, the most famous supplement linked to multiple sclerosis is vitamin D. People with low vitamin D have a higher risk of MS. There's also observational evidence that people with MS with low vitamin D have a worse prognosis on average, like more relapses, although randomized trials don't really show that vitamin D is effective. But given the philosophy you mentioned before, the risk is extremely low, so you advocate for taking it just in case. So, what dose of vitamin D do you recommend? And is there a certain blood level you think we should target?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And just for a bit of background, I would have done some research on vitamin D in Ireland, but not in MS, mostly in respiratory diseases like asthma, COPD, and sleep apnea. Um, and I would have, a fair bit of knowledge around vitamin D. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, like MS is definitely associated with low levels of vitamin D. And then, as you mentioned, low levels of vitamin D seem to make the progression, accelerate as such or associated with acceleration anyway. So the studies then that gave people with MS supplements did not really find much benefit. They were largely disappointing. Um, I still do think vitamin D is important, but probably not the panacea. It's not a cure-all for MS, and probably not really, really high doses. We mentioned that vitamin D, so we have what's called like vitamin D toxicity or hypervitaminosis D. And this is where too much vitamin D, like really, really high levels, can cause, cardiac issues and muscle issues and so on. And this is very extreme and it's very, very rare. But on the flip side, we have evidence showing that, high daily doses of vitamin D in the long run can actually increase things like fall risk, can decrease bone strength, can increase fractures, and so on. So if anybody is considering taking a high dose of vitamin D, we need to weigh that with the risk. And there is, to me, not a huge benefit and a potential risk. So I don't advocate for really high dose vitamin D. In terms of the dose, I think a dose something around 2 to 5,000 is an initial, or sorry, international units, which is about 50 micrograms up to about 100 micrograms daily, is I think appropriate for most people. Obviously, if somebody has a really large body frame, whether they're an athlete or they're carrying a lot of body fat, or they're very tall, for example, they will need more vitamin D, and a blood test will tell you. I always say to my patients, I recommend about a 3 month steady, consistent dosing of vitamin D to find out if you're doing the right thing. So, if you're in sunny Los Angeles, like you are, Dr. Beaber, or if you're in wet Ireland, like I am, do the same thing for about 3 months, with the weather consistent, and then check your blood. And if you can say, well, actually, my level is lower than I would like, then you maybe need to increase the dose. There's actually some really interesting research that people with MS maybe don't have the same response to vitamin D supplements as people without MS, which is quite interesting. But nevertheless, research on vitamin D supplementation has been largely disappointing. Now, when it comes to blood levels, I measured my blood levels, got my blood levels measured once when I was in university, so a long time ago. I don't recommend routine blood testing unless there is a certain indication, or maybe to check once or twice that you're doing the right dosing, and then I don't really think there's any justification to check your levels more often than that. And I think a pretty good blood level is 100 nanomoles per liter, and that's European or Australian measurements. And in America, that'd be the same as nanograms per milliliter, and that's 40 nanograms per millimeter. So 100 nanomoles in Europe or Ireland and 40 nanograms per milliliter. I think is a pretty good dose. After that, we have massive reports showing that when your blood levels go a little bit higher than that, that actually risk, not vitamin D toxicity, but actually health risks. do seem to increase a little bit. Um, so vitamin D trials, as we mentioned, have been disappointing, but vitamin D may take years to have its effect, and we haven't got that data yet where we've done a vitamin D trial for like 10 years on people with MS. So that might never happen. That would be very difficult and expensive to do, but I think vitamin D is definitely important for everybody, and also that everybody should avoid deficiency. But I don't think we've got justification that vitamin D is going to cure MS or really be a panacea for MS and MS symptoms. And then I don't really think we've got justification for really, really high levels of vitamin D either. Um, and the last thing I will say is there's actually significant research showing that sunshine has additional benefits independent of vitamin D. I suppose as humans, we're very used to saying, okay, the sun gives you vitamin D is healthy and it's associated with less MS. So it's obviously the vitamin D supplements. Then we do the trials, we give people vitamin D supplements and it doesn't work. But it turns out the sun seems to have many, many different benefits in terms of our mood, in terms of our blood pressure, in terms of lots of different things in the immune system seem to be modulated by ultraviolet light, not just vitamin D. So I recommend sensible sun exposure. Nobody should be burning ever. So for me, that might look like 10 or 15 minutes, in a short and vest whenever in Ireland we get the sun. In Los Angeles, that might be a little bit less. But I've got a really nice rule, and I call it Kerley's rule after me. How do you know you're making vitamin D? You want your shadow on the ground to be shorter than your body. So it doesn't matter where in the world you are, what time of year it is, or what time of day it is. Just check your shadow. And if your shadow is nice and short, you're looking for about 10, 15 minutes. Preferably expose more skin for less time as opposed to less skin for more time. So what I mean is don't just go out with your face for like an hour or 2 hours because you're going to really burn your face and do damage to your face but not get as much vitamin D. But if you can go out in like a shorts, a vest, a swimsuit, something like this for like 10 minutes. So more skin for less time.
And I'll
And
disclose, even in Southern California, everyone is deficient in vitamin D because we don't go outside and we wear clothing. And I do
yeah,
agree with your general philosophy that it makes sense to take something that's low risk, even if it's unproven. I don't have MS, but I have a very strong family history of osteoporosis, and I take 5,000 international units of vitamin D3 daily, even though the evidence is weak in preventing that condition. But like you said, maybe it has a benefit if you take it consistently over 40 years, and it's pretty much impossible to study that. And the risk is exceedingly low. Someone like me, if I go out in a swimsuit for 5 minutes, I would probably get 5,000 international units. So the idea that it's risky is pretty implausible.
so obviously, you've got quite pale skin and ginger hair, and my skin may not, maybe a little bit less pale. And obviously, some of your patients in the States may be African American and so on. So it depends on your skin tone. So as I always say, somebody with Caucasian skin has a certain amount of capacity to make vitamin D, and it's about 20,000 units in about 20 minutes. So 20,000 units is like a lot. You can do that in about 20 minutes. But someone with darker skin has less efficiency, but the same capacity to make vitamin D. What that means is they can still make 20,000 units, but it might take closer to 1 hour or maybe even more if their skin is quite dark. But obviously, that melanin content in the skin is protecting them from the ultraviolet light. So that's fine in California, where there's lots of sun for lots of the year. But in somewhere like Ireland or North Canada or Scandinavia, somewhere like this, where there's not a lot of sun for a lot of the year, it means somebody with darker skin needs to be a little bit more conscious of vitamin D because even on a sunny day in Ireland, which is rare, they're not going to get enough vitamin D compared to somebody with lighter skin. So 20,000 units for 20 minutes on Caucasian skin, but it's a little bit less efficient in someone with darker skin.
That makes sense for sure. So let's move on to some of the other ingredients that you included. And I'm obviously not so familiar with some of the herbal ingredients you included. So one of the herbs in Neurofix is Andrographis paniculata, excuse the pronunciation. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the science behind it?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, I had a lot of patients coming to see me, and they were coming in with like a small bag of products that they were taking. And some of them had evidence that they were beneficial for health or beneficial for MS. Some of them had no evidence whatsoever, and some of them were quite, had evidence that they might even be harmful. So that was really the inspiration behind me designing a product Neurofix based on all of the research in MS. looking at different problems that people with MS, just like me, face. So one of the ingredients is something called Andrographis paniculata. Your pronunciation was excellent, and it's a native medicinal plant from Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned at the start, a lot of autoimmune diseases have a lot in common, like rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel diseases. So there's research that Andrographis actually helped these conditions. And then further than that, there was research showing that it actually was able to dampen down excess immune response, both the innate immune system, which is largely driven by our white blood cells, and the adaptive immune system, which is mostly driven by our antibody response. And then other studies showing that andrographylide, which is the active component of andrographis, may have neuroprotective effects, in other words, protect the brain and spinal cord. And then finally, there was research done on animal models of MS called AEA. Sorry, EAE, I got it wrong. And these also reported studies. And then finally, just like you, Dr. Beaber, I'm interested in human studies in people with MS, not always in animals. And one study reported that andrographis was able to decrease fatigue in people with MS, and the other one reported something remarkable, that it was able to decrease brain volume loss and decrease disability progression. So as we get older, our brain size naturally decreases a little bit, and we call this brain atrophy. And this happens in everybody, unfortunately, but in people with MS, it actually happens faster. And this is not a good thing. So what they found was the people who got the placebo or the fake pill, and their brains shrunk at a certain pace. And people with MS who got the active andrographis, their brains did not shrink as fast. So this was really interesting. And then the final thing was one thing that I'm always very conscious of is both of these studies and all of the research on andrographis so far show that it's very safe. Of course, when it's used as intended, but very safe with very few side effects. So that was one of the reasons we included andrographylide from andrographis.
Okay, and there are a lot of other ingredients. We don't have to talk about all of them. I'll include some notes with some links explaining the justification behind some of the ingredients. But do you want to highlight a few other ingredients maybe that you think are most important or have the best evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already mentioned andrographis, which I would imagine a lot of people haven't heard of because I wasn't so familiar until I started doing my research on it. So for me as a dietitian, I'm a big fan of food first, but unfortunately, some nutrients just can't really be gotten in the diet. For example, like vitamin D, it's not really found in many foods. So you would have to eat like buckets of fish every day just to get the bare minimum, and there's no other way you're going to get it naturally in the diet. And similarly, we didn't want to include things that could be gotten, like magnesium, which is found in a lot of foods, or different compounds like vitamin C, which are found in a lot of foods. And preferably, we should get those from healthy food sources. But another really interesting ingredient is called Indian frankincense, or Boswellia serrata, is kind of the traditional name. And one of the active ingredients in here is called boswellic acid. And really interesting research from Germany, from an expert neurological team in Germany, showed that this standardized frankincense extract was able to decrease MRI lesions in people with MS by up to 60%. And again, it also showed that it could decrease brain volume loss. And some people actually increased the brain volume, which was absolutely remarkable over the space of a 2 year study. And the same research team took blood samples and showed that this compound actually had major effects on multiple mediators of inflammation. And so it really made sense that it would be able to have effects on MS, which is an inflammatory disorder. Something else we include is called ellagic acid. Ellagic acid can be found in the diet, but only in very small quantities in things like walnuts and pomegranate seeds. So we use an active pomegranate extract, and there's two studies in MS which have shown that ellagic acid can decrease inflammation, decrease disability, decrease fatigue, decrease depression, and at the same time increase serotonin, which is like kind of our feel-good hormone, and also BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And BDNF can help our nervous system, our brain health, our cognition, be a little bit better, a little bit sharper. So all of this was absolutely amazing. As you mentioned, I don't want to talk about all the ingredients, but we also include in there curcuminoids from turmeric extract, piperine from black pepper. We include ginger extract, lutein, which comes from the marigold flower, silymarin from milk thistle, and then vitamin B12. So that's our kind of complex formula, which includes all of the nutrients found to be beneficial in people with MS, but also have been shown to be safe, effective in non-MS immune and inflammatory disorders like asthma or rheumatoid arthritis or type 1 diabetes and so on, and also in MS animal models. So for me, when I put on my clinician hat, I'm thinking, okay, this research is interesting, but it's not 100% proven. But when I put back on my patient hat, I say, okay, this research is really interesting. It probably will help a lot of people, including me, and it's probably unlikely to cause any harm. And for me, we come back to our risk benefit ratio. And I think this product is one of the most powerful and scientific products available on the market today, anywhere.
All right, and I commend you for all the research you did on this. I wasn't familiar with a lot of these ingredients, but I did look into it a little bit after messaging you. You also have a separate product, alpha-lipoic acid. Neurologists are very familiar with this. There's some evidence in neuropathic pain in people with diabetic neuropathy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so alpha lipoic acid is a really interesting one because it's a really powerful antioxidant. So, as I always say to my patients, when you think of an antioxidant, it's kind of the antidote to oxidative stress. And what is oxidative stress? So, most people have eaten an apple at some stage in their life, hopefully recently, where you have an apple, you take a bite, and maybe the phone rings or you forget to finish it, and you come back maybe 5 minutes later and it starts to go brown. So, this is literally the oxygen damaging the apple. And this is essentially how we can visualize oxidative stress happening inside the body, as we consume energy, as we eat food, as we're exposed to pollution, stress, tobacco, whatever else it is, burnt foods, etc. All of these increase our oxidative stress. And the way that we can combat oxidative stress is with antioxidants. And there's a lot of antioxidants found in the diet, especially like our colorful fruits and vegetables, really good sources, green tea, cocoa, and so on, herbs and spices, really good sources of different antioxidants. But alpha lipoic acid is a really, really powerful antioxidant. It's naturally found in the body, which is quite interesting, and also in some foods, but in really, really tiny amounts. And as you mentioned, a lot of clinicians, like neurologists and other clinicians, will be quite familiar with lipoic acid because it does have a long history of use for type 2 diabetes and also type 1, especially when diabetic neuropathy takes place. But there's actually research demonstrating benefit of lipoic acid in many conditions because it seems to be such a powerful antioxidant. But of course, we are interested in MS. So now in 2024, there's 11 trials in humans with MS where they've given lipoic acid versus a placebo. And these trials have reported that lipoic acid can decrease inflammation in people with MS, can increase antioxidant capacity, decrease this oxidative stress. We talked about the apple going brown, can also improve physical function. For example, the timed up and go test, where researchers measure how long it takes a person with MS to get up out of a chair to be able to walk, and also the 25-foot test, which is a 25-foot walk test, which is where researchers measure how long it takes someone with MS to walk 25 feet. And most impressively, one study reported a huge, statistically significant decrease in brain loss in people with MS. So again, this atrophy, that people's brains with MS get smaller over time, that this compound was able to stop that compared to the people with MS who did not get this compound. So again, I've checked this out. I cannot find any major safety risk for lipoic acid, except a tiny risk. I think in 1 in 900,000 people of Japanese heritage need to be careful of something called insulin autoimmune syndrome. But that's the only risk I can find, and I've searched high and low. So again, I come back to that risk benefit ratio, and for me, the benefit is significant and the risk is quite low. So I recommend and I take lipoic acid, and in fact, we actually went on and produced our own lipoic acid product.
All right, very interesting. I wasn't aware of that potential side effect in a small number of people who have Japanese heritage. I'd have to look into it.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, everything we do is led by the science, and I was quite concerned initially because I had heard that lipoic acid could increase this autoimmune condition called insulin autoimmune syndrome. And I think, well, I'm not going to take something which can increase autoimmune activity because I have an autoimmune disease. But I looked into it and it's really, really rare. And it seems to be specifically in people with Japanese heritage. And what's even more interesting is that what happens is insulin kind of gets attacked by the body. In MS, the body attacks the spinal cord in the brain. In this syndrome, the body attacks insulin. But once you stop taking the lipoic acid, this syndrome completely reverses and you're completely back to normal again. So again, for me, that risk is very small and the benefit is quite big.
Yeah, I've prescribed quite a few alpha-lipoic acid supplements, never seen anything like that for sure. So I'm sure it's exceedingly rare. So we
Yeah,
talked a lot about supplements. Going back to diet a little bit, it's very difficult to keep a diet for a long period of time. Maybe it's easier for you because you're studying nutrition every day, you're highly motivated. But for the average person, are your tips for, continuing with the diet as strictly as possible to get the long-term benefits?
sure. So I always say, like medications only work if you take them. And similarly, a lifestyle or a nutrition program only works if you stick to it. Um, a sensible program is not only good for your overall health, but also your MS health and even short-term symptoms like fatigue, physical function, cognitive function, and so on. And we know these are really important to people with MS. So, that's a pretty good thing that if you're saying, oh, I'm just going to go to the party and have a few burgers and a few beers, and you're going to feel horrible for 2 or 3 days afterwards, then, it's probably not a good idea to do that too often. Um, but we need to think of food and really our lives as not just fuel. Like food has tradition, it has cultural significance, heritage. A lot of people make good memories sitting around the table with family and friends, as they absolutely should. I love going to places like France and Spain and seeing families spend 2, 3 hours at the kitchen table or, the table in the garden, and they're enjoying all these delicious foods that maybe out in the sunshine as well. And it's just marvelous to see. So, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, but obviously, if that table is full of like fast food and whatever else, that's probably not going to be the healthiest thing all the time. When it comes to trying to motivate someone, just think about your short and long term health, but also just how you're going to feel. And some people like have no idea how it feels to feel healthy, and then when they feel that, they're like, "Oh my God, this is amazing! I'm never gonna, I'm never gonna go back to the way I was." And that's what I would really recommend. Is the burger worth the burger every day? Is that worth potentially increasing your risk of new lesions over the long term? I would say probably not, but that's for me. What I would say is I would argue that it's much more important to include more healthier foods than to cut out unhealthy foods. Now, obviously, we do both. So you're starting off, you're going to cut down on unhealthy and increase healthy foods. But if you have a choice, I would keep the unhealthy and add in some healthy foods. So we've talked about inflammation a couple of times, but there's some really interesting research studies showing that if you feed somebody fast food, they can get inflammation in the bloodstream and have like paralyzed arteries within a couple of hours. And that's kind of scary. So obviously if you've like fast food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's not very good for your health. But some of this research has also shown that if you simply include like a salad or like some berries or some freshly squeezed orange juice or something like this with the exact same meal, that you actually don't get as much inflammation and your arteries perform much better. So, if you are going to that family occasion or that fast food restaurant or whatever, just try and say, okay, I'm going to make sure that I have a bottle of freshly squeezed orange juice, or I have a salad for a starter, or fruit salad for dessert as well. And some things which can be really beneficial are just planning your meals and saying, okay, I'm not going to arrive home on Monday night at 9 p.m. starving and eat everything around me. It's like you're going to come home and have your dinner in the fridge ready to be heated in the microwave, or a salad ready to go. And things like batch cooking, like I'm still quite busy, so some days I make like dinner for 2 or 3 days, and then it's really easy to just drive past that drive-through and come home and say my dinner will be ready quicker than that drive-through. But what I always say is it really depends on the person. Like it's easy for me to say what works for me, but that may not work for somebody else. So the last thing I would just say is keep healthy foods like within shot, like they're right there beside you. Like you have your fruit bowl on the table, your fridge is full of all the healthy foods. The freezer can be full of frozen vegetables, frozen fruits, maybe even some meals which are frozen and ready to be defrosted, because that makes you much more likely to reach for those. Vice versa, if your fridge is full of soda and candy and chocolate and so on, it's going to be much more tempting that it's in your eye line all the time. Um, One thing I have an issue with is, people feeling guilty over saying, "Oh my God, I had a fast food meal and I had a relapse a week later." That's not really the way human physiology works. It's more about consistency than perfection. So what I mean is it's more about what you do like that 80, 90% of the time than trying to aim for 100% of the time all the time. So if somebody out there is listening and has improves their diet or has a good diet 80, 90% of the time, I think that's amazing, and that is the way to go. I do not stress myself if I have a small amount of whatever it is, whether it be candy or soda or whatever it is. That's not going to make a big difference. Like if you think most people eat 21 meals, will eat 21 meals a week. So if you have one or two unhealthy meals a month, it's like a drop in the ocean compared to everything else.
So I appreciate that. Thank you for all the information. I'll include some links of the key studies we discussed, along with a link to Neurofix and the other supplements from Dr. Kerley if you want to check it out. And do you have any final thoughts about nutrition or supplements in people with multiple sclerosis or other advice?
How long have we got? I could be here all day because, as you can see, I love talking about these sort of things. So, one thing is, when we think about MS, there's a lot of things involved. We talk about inflammation, we talk about the immune system, we talk about brain health, we talk about gut health, like the gut microbiome, some people might have heard of, and we talk about oxidative stress, which you mentioned, like the apple going brown. So, it turns out that whole kind of plant foods, like your fruits, your vegetables, your nuts, your seeds, are really good for gut health and oxidative stress and inflammation and the immune system and the brain health. So these are foods which everybody should be consuming without even considering is it controversial or is it a good idea or not. Try and include these as often as you can within your daily diet. And there's no other way around it, I don't think, at least with the best evidence. So the last thing is, I think it is important to remember food is not just fuel. It's not just to get healthy nutrients into your body. It's about enjoying food and, making memories and maybe tasting new foods if you're traveling and so on. So don't feel guilty if you do, fall off the bandwagon or don't have a perfect day because there is no such thing as a perfect day. Include as best you can those healthy foods we talked about as often as you can. And life is hard. We all have our struggles daily, and life with MS is even harder. I'm doing quite well, thank God, over the last 22 years, but I'm sure someone will listen to this video and may have some disabilities or may have some advanced disabilities. So life is hard. We all have to eat. We all just have to eat, and that's just a thing. I choose to eat according to what I think is the best scientific available. But if we have some treats, etc., from time to time, that's absolutely fine. And remember, consistency beats perfection every single day.
Well, thank you for your time and your advice and your contribution to nutrition and research for people with MS and other diseases. Have a good evening, and maybe we'll connect in the future or even meet in person.
Absolutely. And the last thing I would just say, if anybody needs any help with anything at all, feel free to connect with me. I'm available on all the social media channels, and hopefully Dr. Beaber will be able to include some links. But my name is a good old Irish one, Conor Kerley. So just Google that and you'll find me, and be delighted to connect with anybody and help any way I can.